name is Diana Tate Vermeer. I'm the SVP of Strategy at Schott Foundation for Public Education. My pronouns are she, her, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today. So thank you so much for joining a discussion on EndowNow, a game-changing strategy for investing in racial justice. We're so happy for you to be with us today. A few housekeeping items just really quickly. I wanted to share with you that Schott Foundation is recording this session, so we are mic'd and going to keep some video recording of this session, but if you are not in the screen or in the shot, but just wanted to make sure that you were aware of that as we move forward. I'm also going to take a moment to introduce each of our panelists who are going to be in discussion with us here today, and given this, the group and the size, we really hope that this is a discussion, an engagement with each of you about what is the opportunity, what we all see as the chances, and what we can do to truly invest in transformational change in our communities. As I introduce our folks, I always like to hear a little bit from panelists about why they do the work they do. So I'm going to introduce them one at a time and ask them to do that, set the stage a little bit, give some context to our discussion, and then we'll jump right in. And we hope that you are engaged participants in that. So start thinking of your questions and what you want to hear and put to the group because we welcome that. So thank you again for being here. Again, Diana Vermeer at the Schott Foundation. Here to my right is Dr. John Jackson, the president and CEO of Schott Foundation for Public Education. John, why is it that you do the work that you do?
I do it, I've been doing it because I'm in a position to do it because someone did it before me. And I just think that we have that obligation, and I'm from the south side of Chicago, and I see the hundreds and thousands of other young people who are still there. If they have the opportunity, we can do so much more.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. To John's right is Zakia Ansari. She's the Advocacy Director at Alliance for Quality Education, AQE, and she is also a Schott board member, someone who is near and dear to our heart. Why do you do the work that you do?
I think initially it started because I have 8 children, and so I actually knew they would all be all right educationally, but as I started to understand what organizing was, I realized back then I was planning for doing this work so my grandchildren didn't have to struggle and their children didn't have to struggle, and so now I have grandchildren in schools and we still haven't figured this liberation, freedom thing out yet, so I'm just in it for the long haul.
Thank you. And to her right is Lee Parker with JP Morgan Private Bank, a banker and executive director who's committed to these issues. Why do you do the work you do?
So I was thinking about that question, and when I was having a conversation with Diallo, it reminded me that when I was growing up, my parents had a business. They owned a hardware store. And this was before the Home Depots and the Lowe's came on the scene. Well, when they did come on the scene, my parents had to shut their business down because they didn't have the resources to pivot. And it was, when I reflect back on that moment, that was the pivotal moment where I said, I want to make sure that individuals and families of color have the resources they need to achieve whatever they wish to achieve. And I broaden that to individuals and then also institutions. So whatever your goals are, social or otherwise, my role is to make sure that I help you get access to the resources you need in order to achieve that. So that's why I do what I do.
Wonderful. And last but not least, we have with us Derek Johnson, President and CEO of the NAACP. What brought you to your work?
So thinking about childhood, I think we all have those tipping points that kind of inform what we end up doing, whether we realize it was that tipping point. I grew up in Detroit, rough neighborhood, but a beautiful neighborhood. We could talk about it pre-crack, post-crack. Our house was one of those houses that was seen as a safe haven, first because of my great aunt, and then later my mother. And so helping people was a part of what the family did. Secondly, we used to love to hear that Coleman Young, who was the mayor, was going to be on television because we knew he was going to cuss every time he was on TV. And for someone that was in elementary, middle school, and high school, his cussing later evolved for me that he was fighting for the city that he was protecting. And then thirdly, I can recall the first time I seen Eyes on the Prize on PBS. This is pre-cable. We had 5 stations: ABC, CBS, NBC, PBS, and CBC, because it was right across the street from Windsor. And I remember, and I can't remember how old I was, that I was standing on a couch punching the air when I seen the dogs being placed on the children. And so now that in this role, it's about helping people, it's about protecting community, it is about making sure we can really aspire to a higher opportunity compared to where many of us have come from and what structural barriers have been put in front of us.
Thank you for that. So we have in front of us a team of experts, folks committed to racial justice in their life and their commitment to their work, focused on education justice. I think we all know that public education is under attack. It has long been under attack. As we have opened the schoolhouse doors to more and more and different children, so has the attacks on public education increased and intensified, whether it be in the policing of schools, the funding of schools, the curriculum in schools, the access to various interventions and supports for students, what we can take away when we have the opportunity to, because we think too many people are having access. And so many of us have been long committed to education justice. And now is this pivotal moment where the anti-CRT attacks have been used not only to attack the curriculum and to push back advances in public education that have been made by our advocates who have long been doing this work, but it's also a time to actually attack democracy, right? It's a local level fight. And so that's the context that we're in now. It seems even more important to figure out how to invest in long-term solutions, invest in the communities and the folks on the ground in real and sustained ways. And so that's how we're gonna center our conversation now about the opportunity of endowments and learn a little bit more about what Schott Foundation is trying to do in its work and what that promise may be for others of our colleagues in philanthropy to do something transformational and continue to invest in the long-term sustainability of the work we all know to be super important. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John to give a bit of a greater context for our discussion today.
Thank you, Diana. Good morning.
Good morning.
So we are having a family discussion here, and I won't do like Coben Young and cuss anybody out, but it is a discussion, and it's not personal, but it is personal, because we in philanthropy, we do a lot of good and we do a lot of harm. And often the case is, in order to become better, we've got to be very reflective on the ways that we may cause some harm and the things that we can do better. So I'm not talking about anyone, I'm just saying what I'm saying. I want to start off first. The Schott Foundation is a public fund. We serve as an intermediary between philanthropy and grassroots advocacy organizations. And what we mean by that is philanthropy has happened for a number of years, decades, but often the case is the dollars don't flow the same way to BPOC-led organizations. This we know. There are a host of practices and policies and processes that we have in place that somehow serve as a barrier to these organizations getting the resources. So for the past 30 years, the foundation has tried to bridge that gap between philanthropy and grassroots youth-led and parent-led organizations. So we are celebrating our 30th year anniversary this year. And as a part of doing this work, we as a foundation also have to be reflective on how we can become better in doing this work. And so what I want to talk a little bit about is a strategy that over the past 18 months in consultation with our board of directors, we sort of put forward. And I'll tell you a little more about it as we get into it. The first part of it, I want you to imagine that you were presented with a job opportunity, running an organization, maybe even a foundation. And as a part of that, what they told you was, you are going to run this foundation, but we are only going to give you dollars when there's a crisis. All right? You only get crisis funding. And then they say, well, you know, there may be some occasions where we will also provide you just enough resources to write the checks, what we would call checkbook philanthropy. We're familiar with that in philanthropy, right? But you often don't see an organization doing checkbook philanthropy because there's no resources there for staff capacity to process the checks or what have you. But then we also said, well, it might be a good idea to provide beyond just checkbook philanthropy and crisis resources, some resources to build the staff capacity. Do you like the job a little better now? Now you have staff to do the job, right? You have the opportunity to do good by writing checks, and you have crisis funding. But the final part of that is you might want to ask for, and you might want to understand how often you're going to receive those resources. Some sustainable funding resource. This isn't anything in this scenario that is foreign to the philanthropic sector, because in the philanthropic sector, crisis funding, we call it rapid response funding. Checkbook philanthropy, in many respects, we call it programmatic support. Unrestricted, we call it capacity building. This has been the evolution of philanthropy. We started, in many respects, we recognized that we had to go beyond rapid response funding because we needed to maintain the capacity of the organizations. We recognized that they needed more programmatic support. Over the last 2 years of what we've seen, many of the philanthropic partners have talked about providing unrestricted resources and capacity building. And yet, in the evolution of philanthropy, there's a piece that we've left out: sustainable funding, endowing organizations. And this isn't anything that should be foreign to us, because the majority of institutional foundations are funded through endowments. That's our power source. That's how we maintain, that's how we plan, and yet there are organizations that we work with, that we care about, that we haven't strategically taken the step to provide sustainable funding. We know that within racial equity and justice organizations are underfunded. This is a study that we did with Candid, and Candid collects data on philanthropic giving. And from 2017 to 2019, there was over $1.4 billion provided in philanthropic funding. Yet only 10% of that was provided racial equity funding. 10%, 109. And of that, only less than 1% was provided in racial justice funding. Well, you know, the difference there is when you look at racial equity, often the case when you talk about racial equity, it's to provide the supports, the tools. And when we talk about racial justice, it's to provide the ecosystem. I'll give you an example. You can have, in the voting context, you can have an equal number of voting polls, an equal number of precinct workers. But if the ecosystem in which individuals are voting in is oppressive, then you don't have a just voting system. You won't get an equitable and just outcome. So we need racial equity and racial justice, of which both are underfunded in this space. But also, as we talk about sustainable funding, we look at endowments. From 2000 to 2013, only 5% of gifts of $10 million or more to social change causes took the form of an endowment. Endowments for organizations led by people of color are nearly 4 times smaller than those led by white-led organizations, and their average revenue is less than half. So again, as we look at the evolution of funding, the evolution of philanthropy, somehow this is a component that we have yet to integrate into supporting these organizations. And it's not because of the organizations. One might say, well, we don't know if these organizations can handle this money. We don't know what they can do. Because if you look at many of these youth-led and parent-led organizations, they're already doing more with less. They're doing the critical work. They're showing up at the school board meetings. They are organizing at our state capitals. They're registering voters. They're doing more than less. The return on investment that we've seen is clear. So it's not a matter of impact. You know, at the Schott Foundation, there was, and Dakia will tell you more about this, an organization that Schott funded for the past 20 years plus. And we probably provided $20 million over that 20-year period. I won't ask you to think about your portfolios and how long you've funded one organization. But for 20 years, we funded AQE, the Alliance for Quality Education, $20 million. Last year, from that advocacy, they won $4 billion from the New York State Legislature. Now, who would take that return on investment? $20 million for a $4 billion public return. And it's about providing sustainable resources. They do more with less. They have the impact. You don't believe? Take an organization like the NAACP, and I'm glad Derek is joining us today. Organization where the impact has been clear. The 1964 Civil Rights Act doesn't happen without the NAACP. The Voting Rights Act, 100 years, doesn't have an endowment. Number of philanthropic supporters, it's not for a lack of desire, but we haven't taken that next step. So they do more with less, the impact is clear, and yet we haven't. Part of the reason and part of the conversation today is one of the main pieces that we underestimate in our philanthropic process is trust. Trust is a commodity. And too often we've sort of built these transactional relationships with grantee partners and even within our institutions. But it has to start with trust-based philanthropy. Trusting that they have the knowledge and context that's necessary. Trusting that they have the tactics that are necessary to bring about systemic change. And trusting that they know how to use the resources better than we do. And often the case, we're holding on to the resources. It's really built off of some type of ideology that says, we know how to use these resources to help you better than, so we're gonna hold on to them. So it starts with trust-based philanthropy. Then we understand that there has to be a strategic effort to build the capacity of the organizations. Yes, they've done more with less, but they could do more with more. And when we look across society, more is necessary right now. More is necessary. So why wouldn't we take the next step and build sustainable funding sources, sustainable planning for these organizations? And I say this because those that we're pushing against, those that are fighting for the inequities, and there are those who are fighting for inequities right now, that don't want it, they're in it for the long haul. Fortunate enough, these organizations, our grantee partners, have been in it for the long haul. So the fight is going to be for the long haul. They're in it for the long haul. Their resources should be in it for the long haul. So I said 18 months ago, at the Schott Foundation, went to the board and I asked the board, could we perhaps raise $30 million? That's more money than we have in our own assets. Could we raise $30 million and give that $30 million to 3 organizations so that they would have endowments larger than our endowment? $10 million each. And that's what we've set out to do. When we launched the Racial Justice and Education Endowment, it's a $30 million fund in which we will provide 3 National Education Alliance organizations, Education National Alliance organizations, $10 million endowments. During the 5-year period, they will be a part of the investment committee. They will receive the technical support, training, and we will gain from their insight on how to invest these dollars. Why $30 million? Because $30 million at the end of the 5-year period at a 5% drawdown will produce $1.5 million in unrestricted resources for their budgets each year. And as those dollars increase, that annual drawdown amount increases. We know this. We work in that space. So this is an effort that we're putting forward. And we're happy to be working with Lee Parker at J.P. Morgan to structure the type of support, technical assistance, and to leverage the type of impact that's worthy of the work that these leaders across the country, passionate people, and organizations that have proven impact and done more with less, has proven they should have these resources. We didn't do it yesterday. If we try to do it tomorrow, it's too late. That's why we say we have to endow now. But it's going to take more than just this effort. It's going to take philanthropy as a whole leaning in and completing this evolution of how we support these organizations. So I'll pause there, take my seat, and then we'll have a more fruitful discussion as we hear from our other partners. Thank you.
Thank you, John. You did a great job of laying out the case for endowments and sort of charting out what our organization has been doing and why. You know, we've made a bit of a call that says, join us in this effort. If you are, as a president, as you're thinking about this, what are the things that you would share with folks about what they should be thinking about if they were going to consider an endowment such as this?
Well, first, looking at the policies of your organization. There are some foundations that have written in policy that they don't support endowment. And as we begin to talk about what are some of the structural barriers to equity that exist within our sector, we know the benefit of endowments. So why would such a policy exist within our organizations? I would say there's also a learning process, a learning agenda that has to come. Because I mentioned I had to go to a board. And I had to go to a board with a request that would be very extreme in a lot of boardrooms. But it was a board that was ready over years. We had sort of cultivated a space of asking how can we do more, critiquing our own practices and policies. So I would start there. First, be aware of what if any constraints exist within your existing organizations. And secondly, how do you build the type of learning agenda that makes it possible?
Thank you for that. Thank you. Well, and Derek, John mentioned that NAACP is exploring its own endowment, doesn't have an endowment,
Right.
a historic and important organization for all of us in this family. What have been your sort of challenges and opportunities as the exploration has continued for you all?
So, I love when John do presentations because the graphics are always great and clear. And one of the things that jumped off the page on that, when you look at Black institutions, Jeff Bezos gave one individual $100 million without any parameters. That's more than 99% of HBCU's endowment. One individual. So we have fallen to this broader culture where we are celebrating individual as opposed to institution building. And so the NAACP, like many of our historic or traditional or even new institutions, have been, robbing Peter to pay Paul. We just recently launched our endowment. It's a quiet campaign. The $600 million goal, we've already raised $60 million. And in the conversations that we've been having with foundations particularly, they start with, well, we really don't do endowments. Then you go point and say, but you made an exception for this thing over here. Or you consider this thing over there. When we know that the requirements and restrictions for Black-led institutions are always much more rigorous than it is for other institutions. Without naming the foundation, there was a conversation that was had about 12 years ago now, over dinner, an agreement made to give an individual $17 million for an organization that had not been created, and the deal was written on the back of a napkin. This individual happened to be the state superintendent of education for Mississippi, while the same institution was funding groups to fight against this individual.
Right.
So then comes the question is, are foundations really working against itself?
Yes.
Or are they really committed to racial and social justice? And even when they fund racial justice, it's not Black-led organizations, particularly when you're talking about larger pots of money. So as I walked into this space, you all know you've experienced NAACP in many ways, and good and bad. Right? Be honest, right? I'm there now. I've been associated with the NAACP since undergrad as a volunteer up into taking this position. John actually created our departments around programs when he was over education to build it out. See Robert back there. I mean, we've experienced NAACP in many ways, and oftentimes when you look at our institutions, we always don't treat them well. We have to, nurse them to health over and over again. But then when you look a little deeper, they are so underfunded, they are so underdeveloped that we don't even have an opportunity to bring the best talent to make sure we have the systems in place to ensure the longevity of our institutions. So this conversation is really important. And as program officers or program executives within philanthropy, I ask you, don't buy into the norm of what the foundations have always done. Actually, we must push the envelope. When I served on the foundation board, what would excite me the most if I had a program officer to come up with something that was creative and nuanced and figure out how to way to get around the quote strategy that changed every 4 or 5 years to really talk about empowering people and empowering communities. But if we're not doing that when we are getting in these seats, then we only become the tool to maintain the status quo, and the status quo isn't working for our communities.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Yep. So, Zakiya, you are in the communities, you are on the ground, you're doing this work. How do we get away from the status quo, and what does an endowment mean for you and your work?
It's so interesting when we were having this conversation about endowment. I literally had to look it up. Like I Googled it. Like, what is an endowment? Like, normally I would just come to a space like, oh yeah. And I'm like, okay, well, if an endowment allows us to do our work every year without worrying about, do we fulfill this commitment to make sure, do we dot the I and the T on that grant that we got? Do we have enough money to bring 5 buses to Albany as opposed to 2 buses to Albany? Can we put up Facebook ads and other things to talk about our issue area? How many can we do? We really need this, but we can only do this, right? And can we provide trainings for our parent leaders specifically that go outside of the grain of not just the work that we do, but this mental health, healing, self-care thing that our parents need as well as we do? Would an endowment allow us to do that? Heck yeah. So I'm all in for the endowment. And at a certain point, to John's point, we had an unofficial endowment with SHOT. Was it all the money that we had to work from? No, we had other grants and things, but they were willing to commit to us for 20. They have been our longest. I don't know. I just assumed that grantors do that. It's long term. No, they are an anomaly. And it wasn't just the money, it was the relationship. So it's even beyond the $20 million investment. It's that if I have an idea and I'm not sure about it, that I can call John on the phone, and John picks up the phone. Now you heard what that man just said. He spoke, and it's just like, wow. I'm sitting there in awe of that I even know this person next to me that I can call and he will do this. And then he makes stuff happen. And so it's about the trust that was shared. It matters. It matters. And Black and brown communities where people often extract from us over and over again without even leaving anything behind. To have someone who can offer you dollars to actually get the work done. Is it all that you need? No. But not only do they give us the money, but they give us the time, right? And they put us in spaces like this where we can share our story and our voices, and that people can learn about who we are and what we do. And that's invaluable, right? And we don't take it lightly, because trusting relationships at whatever level you are in, right, personal or otherwise, are things you hold on strong to, right? And we do that. And then we're part of the Journey for Justice Alliance. I'm a co-initiator with G2 Brown. And that national work that we do, it just is this really beautiful sistering and brothering and partnering of the work of what we're doing on a statewide level in New York, but also across the country, that there are other organizations that we could offer our expertise, because there are not many groups, we're 21 years old, that have been doing this work so long, statewide work, right? And so how do we share in these moments, right? How do we go to each other and be able to talk to each other in person? I mean, COVID's here, granted, but we know there's nothing like in-person conversations and seeing each other and being able to look into each other's eyes and share those stories, or tears, or laughter, or anger, or righteous indignation about what's happening, and be able to talk to somebody who looks like you about these issues without having to worry about, am I looking too angry? Am I saying the right things? Oh, I'm sorry, did I use the right language, right? It matters. It matters. In this moment right now, more than ever, it matters. It always has, but it matters right now. And all the things around that was shared, and I'll stop, around attack on democracy and all those things, education is the one place that I never thought politics was in until I got involved in it. And it is deeply entrenched in everything we do. From people not wanting to engage because, I don't know, I might lose my job. I get that, right? To students and others, you get suspended if you're engaged in a battle and a struggle because for your rights. Are we serious right now? Right? So it's deeply entrenched in politics. And the power of being able to not have to worry about whether or not you can keep focused on that line and do your work, knowing that there will be things coming at you from all over, because we have funding to do that. We have relationships. So if we don't know, we will have supports to do that. There's nothing like that. And so let's do it. Let's endow now. Let's figure out what those organizations are. We saw, SHOT is doing it. But whatever it is, because the other side, family, the other side, The money is falling out of their pockets and they can't pick it up fast enough to dismantle all the things, all the years, hundreds of years of things that we've been doing just to make minimum. They about to tear it all down, unapologetically with a smile and in their best suit.
So, Zakiya, with that, you have really laid forth the urgency of the moment, the urgency to move forward. We've talked about trust. John's mentioned it. You've mentioned the importance of trust in the work that we do and how we move forward. I'm going to bring Lee into the conversation a little bit about sort of endowments themselves, this investment tool and the promise that you see from them, but also beyond that, what it means to build trust, right? To me, this is an extension of trust-based philanthropy. How do we really support? How do we let go? John mentioned it. How do we let go? How do we give it over and let the folks lead? So what are some of the components that folks need to think about if that extension of trust is really, truly given and supported?
Yeah. I love that question, and I'm going to pick up on when Zakiya said the other side and give you all a picture of, in my world, financial services, what the other side really looks like. By sharing this with you. A story that a gentleman who used to work for a philanthropic institution in DC, and they were pitching to a white donor leading a family foundation that they wanted this family to invest in black and brown boys in initiatives that were going to support black and brown boys in Prince George's County, Maryland. Great enthusiasm, great concept, not going to get into the strategy. The response from that white donor was that they're not worthy of my dollars. That's the other side, okay? So if that's the other side, then let's be clear that, as everybody on this panel has said, there's a moment. But I think, as Zakiya also said, let's understand what endowments are and are not, because that's the baseline to what the opportunity is and where the trust, right, needs to begin. So, you know, I'm a visual person, so you're probably going to hear a lot of stories from me, which is if you were to go on a trip and we're sitting on the East Coast and you want to go to the West Coast and you're preparing for that trip, no one in this room would say you're not going to make sure you have the resources to get to the West Coast. But if you're traveling from, you leave here and you can only go as far as 2 states, that means you have a certain amount of dollars. And if something happens, your car breaks down, you have what is called unrestricted funds to address that emergency. Not-for-profits have unrestricted funds to address emergencies, to if something happens, right? And philanthropy will fund unrestricted dollars and want to make sure that not-for-profits have those emergency funds. But if we're going on a trip and I have the dollars to get to the West Coast and enjoy myself in California, and I can do that multiple times, I have a set of dollars that are set aside to make sure that I can achieve my goal. I am well resourced. So my question is, why on earth would a donor, foundation or otherwise, engage in a relationship with a not-for-profit where they could only get to a certain point on their journey? And what John and the Schott Foundation said to me was, is there a way for an investment tool to be created that allows for pooled dollars to come together from any individual, and then at the same time, those individuals who are going to receive those endowment dollars can also understand how to set up an endowment, how to manage it, and then also how to distribute and how to raise money for it. Those are 2 important pieces. And I'm going to stop there because I don't want to get too far into the next question. But what I think, Diana, is really, really important is that when we're talking about endowment, we are talking about the fact that individuals and institutions are essentially saying, I believe in your ability to achieve your goal in the short term, and I know it's going to take many years for you to achieve that goal, which may be beyond my lifetime. And I'm going to make sure that I put the dollars forward for you to get to the other side or to achieve that goal. That is essentially what an endowment is. And if you think about the fact that the baseline of an endowment for a nonprofit is that you should have 2 times what your operating budget is. Let's say your operating budget is $500,000. Last year, if you had an endowment of $1 million, you could have funded your budget, that not-for-profit, by 50%. So a not-for-profit would not have to sit down with John and say, we have an emergency moment. This is what we need to do. We need more buses. We need more people. They would have had the investment vehicle that is working for that not-for-profit to support their ability to achieve whatever that goal is. And that's part of the partnership, the trusting relationship that's developed. So that's what I would describe as what a trust opportunity looks like, and what the opportunity is to make sure somebody gets to their destination. Otherwise, they're never going to get to the destination. They're always going to be in an emergency moment, which is what John described.
Right. Well, and I think, you talk about it, the emergency moment, any moment. It's the ability to quickly respond, right? If we're talking about what is happening now, we've talked about how do we respond and quickly? Who gets to respond? Folks are on the ground, but they weren't prepared for what has become the CRT fight, right? They were working, they had their agenda, they had their plans. This was an emergency that needed to be responded to. So I think the promise is also the ability to not have to go out and say, here's a new issue that I need funding for. I just need to respond. And so, I don't know, Zakiya, if you talk about that, like what does it mean, or the promise or the ability, with either SHOT's long-term investment or otherwise, to be able to do the work with a certain amount of freedom, I think is also the potential promise of what we're talking about.
I was kind of writing that down. Like, I could burst out in tears anytime. I'm actively fasting for Ramadan, and it has really connected me to a moment where I used to cry all the time, but I haven't cried in years, even no matter how sad I get. And so I'm appreciative of that. But that worthy piece really got me. Because, well, I actually appreciate them being honest enough to say that, because there's so many folks that just play around and mess around. But to stay focused. So I was thinking about that, the other things that we need to do in these moments is like funding to endow, like staff up, communications. There's things that people take for granted that someone who is endowed or just has money, they can just do on a whim. So when we don't often have to shift totally things, sometimes things are just really communications based. But because we're so small and we got to stay on this path, we can't even shift in that moment to just be like, can y'all put out some stuff around this, a statement or whatever, because we just want to make sure that we get our voice into this moment. And the thing around critical race theory specifically, we were able to move. I called John. John, did you hear this thing? What's going on? What can we do, John? John made it happen. John made it happen with a bunch of other partners, right? With Race Forward, Metro Center, and us like working to actually initially have conversations to then raise money, which is not nearly what we need to do this work, but it's something that we were able to get the money out quickly as we talk about bureaucracy and, sign out these 10 forms in triplicate and pass them on, and we need this by this, that. No, we cut out that middle person to be able to do that, to get these monies to groups that were doing the work already, and now this sort of critical race theory has come into their space. The goal is not to chase critical race theory, it is to continue to fight for the things that they were fighting for already. Whether it's police-free schools, whether it's culturally responsive education, whether it's anti-bias and training for educators, like whatever those things are, it's to be able to use this moment to actually push for the things that we want, or the victories that we already won that people are trying to reverse in this moment right now. And so to be able to have money that allows us to do that, boom, we're gonna get 2 buses to go to the school board meeting this week. We ain't gotta worry, we're gonna have food. We're going to have childcare. We're going to have translation. We're going to have all those things. We ain't got to worry about what it's going to cost because we got the money to be able to do that. You know how many times that stops us from doing things? Because we can't even do that. Unacceptable, right? Meanwhile, then people go, or you get a small number of people that go to a school board meeting to be on the reverse end, on the other end of racist, nasty things that people are saying at you because you are trying to express what you feel and that this is wrong. So imagine what that looks like. Also in these moments, like, security is needed. Well, who can think about security when you're like, we need 2 buses, that's 40 people on the bus, we need masks, we need like all the things. And when you get there, you realize, oh damn, like we could use some security. Like all these things that pop up in your head that you don't know in the moment and you have to calculate because you don't have the leisure of saying we need this, like the other side says, we're gonna print out some signs and y'all just go ahead and y'all say what y'all wanna say and we'll bring you back, right? And it's these moments of having to do that makes us pause and stop from being as productive as we can be. Listen, I keep saying this, in this moment right now, I've been doing this for 20-something years now. This is not a coincidence, the moment we're in. It's not a coincidence that you are in this room right now, that we are sitting here, that people have 30 years in, 20 years in, 100 years in, and that we're in this moment to say endow now. That's not a coincidence. It is a positive. And how do we actually take on this moment right now to say, I'm here for the moment. I'm in this room, my hour and a half, my time is valuable, but what they're saying right now makes sense to me. And how do I translate this back? Because you may not be the ones making decisions. We get it. We understand. It's a process. It's a board. It's this. You got to convince this person. It's exhausting to try to tell somebody why black boys are worthy. Why black boys are worthy. Why black children and children of color, indigenous people are worthy. It's exhausting. So shout out to all of you who can do that work, and we all have had to do that work. It's exhausting, right? This work is exhausting, and sometimes we need to tap out, but we ain't got the money to even tap out sometimes. Like I need a break. I need to tap out for a day. I need to tap out for a week. We need a break to recharge, to rejuvenate. Right? But the movement, the work got to continue, right? And so what are the sacrifices we have to make in the midst of making sure that we are saving this country's democracy, that we are saving public education, and that we are saying that all children are worthy. They're worthy of all that we can give them. And so what are we going to do when we hear it? Because John could have came in and said AQE. We did this, but you have AQE. I'm sitting here saying what we did. It's a much different impact when you're hearing from the people that do the work than being able to say, oh, that was interesting and John invested that much, and that's really awesome, a $4 billion return. But now Zakiya can share the long work that we've been doing with parents and community members on the ground, with educators and young people, to try to keep a Foundation Aid formula sexy for 21 years, to make people understand why it's important for them to engage in this. That we have young people who are working with us, who are working with us volunteering, who have worked with us as interns in college, right? That connection, that trust, that relationship, and to Lee's point, and I'm gonna stop, for many of us who do this advocacy work, when we hear big banks and corporations, many times we're on the other end of like, y'all need to stop and stop funding this and this, that, and the other. It's relationships though. Because had I not known even where Lee is from, her spirit, her energy, and what she's saying to me relates to me. Right? It relates to me. So I'm like, hell yeah, Lee, let's get that money. Reparations, whatever you want to call it. Let's get that money to do this work. Because our children are worthy. But it takes us building relationships, and many of our folks on the ground don't have the leisure or the opportunity to connect with Lee as a person. So how do we make sure that they understand that the organization that, as your point, Derek shared, do these foundations work counter to what they should be doing? They fund folks who are charter folks, and you may love charters and all that stuff, but the reality is what they're doing in public education is not cool and not okay. And at the same time, give scholarships and other things. Well, what we want to take, like you giving us a scholarship, that's cool, but at the same time you dismantling the school system that I got the scholarship from, something ain't right there, right? Like this, so there's a moral piece to this too. And I'll stop there just to say, like this moment is overwhelming, but it's ripe, and we're ripe for it. And are we ready to meet it? Meet it as deeply and as hard and as unapologetically as we can in this moment. These people up here, I believe you are, because you came here for a reason. The reality is what we're going to do once we walk out of this room. And I'm just going to keep pleading that happens. And it doesn't have to be this endowment. It'd be great. But there's so many of us out there doing this work. There's just so many. And we need help. We're drowning. We're drowning.
Diana, can I
Yes,
just
please.
add that, so one, I had to hold myself back from crying. So, but one of the things that popped to mind is this word of access, right? So when we're talking about trust, and I think about the journey that we are on, it is about access and also control. And again, in my world, financial services world, I believe my role in this is to make sure that every single partner here and beyond has access. So when John and I had a conversation 5 years ago, he said, I have an idea, and this is what I want to do. My role was to solve for how he was going to get that done, okay? To provide him access to what the bank had to offer that I believe, quite frankly, had he had that conversation with anybody else, it would have been, no, we can't do that,
Definitely.
right? So John and I went on a journey to make sure that, okay, we could figure out a way to bring the idea to fruition. That's one. The other is to, even inside of the bank, to release controls over things to create this vision. And when I say release controls, what I mean by that is that there's certain ways in which banks do things, there's certain ways in which foundations do things. What we're talking about is changing that dynamic to say, we've done things this way, but has it worked? Okay, and I'm calling the question, I'm saying it might have worked, but perhaps not the right way, right? Or this is a complement to expand upon what is already being done. So I think in my world, it is the access and control and loosening those things, creating those things so that Zakiya and Shot have access to not just the bank, but have access to those people who are saying they're not worthy. And my role is to say, I need you to think about this a little bit differently.
So access is a good word for financial institutions. Why? There's a tipping point financially that nonprofits have in their bank account that opens up a whole suite of things that otherwise we pay for.
That's right.
For example, endowment planning, and they give you that. They provide advisory. But here's the most important thing. SPLC has preyed on black misery for decades. Decades. They're sitting on over $500 million now in an endowment, plus another $3 to $4 million to sit in an account on top of their annual operating budget. I'm mad at them. They figured out the game and they leverage, right? What I learned in this seat, because we have done okay, is once you hit a certain threshold, depending on what financial institution you're with, they open the door to their wealth management division. And then there, you start getting in front of audiences of individuals right around tax consideration time, so they can determine whether they're going to give to you, to you, to you.
Exactly.
And in most cases, there are not a single people of color-led organization at the table. That's why Sierra Club can be the group that it is, or it operates with $300+ million budget, or Emily's List, or Planned Parenthood, or you name the organization that's either non-black led or Latino led or non-black focused, Latino focused. Because once they hit that threshold, all of these Jeff Bezos types, because we know about him, but what about all of the people that was in his organization that received the windfall?
Exactly.
Every year they're making a decision on where they're going to give 10 million here, 20 million here, 30 million here, because they want the tax write-off. And so access is a real opportunity. Disaster capitalism is also in philanthropy and nonprofit community. That when the disaster hit, people descend and they profit mightily off of nonprofit misery in our communities. Katrina is my most intimate experience. And I'm on the Mississippi side, you have the New Orleans side, and I watched everybody descend. Then I seen the groups descend, and then philanthropy began to fund people who were not indigenous to the area, and within 5 years, particularly in New Orleans, everybody had left. And it was a vacuum. You know, with our little small part in Mississippi, we said we don't want no outsiders. We created a wall. And because we did that, our organizations for the first time grew. Because we was on the same treadmill of the 200,000 grant here, or 100,000, until we blocked it off when the money came in, the organizations grew. But what was most unique is when philanthropy also tried to prescribe the solution to the problem. One organization, I'm not gonna mention because he's my friend, he's over it now, they came down in East Biloxi that says, this area here is gonna be all green space. It was a third African American, a third Vietnamese community, and working poor whites, and they just wrote the whole community off. We had to fight against them. At the exact same time, that set of funders who wanted to do that started endowing organizations that's in that same community, but on the other side of town, to do their work to reimagine the reconstruction through a charrette process. I had never heard of the word charrette. I'm from Detroit. We don't talk about charrettes. And that's why I say the status quo isn't working. And the concept of empowering our community-based organizations, our national organizations, this should not be a competition. Social justice isn't a competition.
That's right.
And what we're doing with organizations, we're pitting one against the other who are actually needed completely. There's not a single black organization that's true to their mission and is a mission about helping people that I see myself in competition with.
That's right. That's right.
And we should not do that. And it's enough money.
Yes.
But we need philanthropy to change the model so we can hit that threshold and go to the financial institution and say, open the door.
That's right.
Because some of the individuals who can write those big checks, they don't know we exist. And if they did, you know, you got some racists that know they're not deserving of my money, but you got a whole set of 37-year-old billionaires who have no concept and actually with some right conversations willing to do the right thing. That's why endowments are important, because it empowers.
So, John, I'm turning to you now. Our partners have laid out the case. They've told us about what we do. We know that we have family in the room. We know that we have folks committed to the work and to these efforts. You mentioned the process you went through with our board, right? So laying that foundation, the readiness, what is it that you might share with our colleagues about what they can be doing to lay that foundation, open the door, allow for the kind of transformational change and access that we've been talking about?
Sure. I mean, this isn't a foreign concept to individuals that sit on the boards of foundations. Number one, we're managing endowments.
That's right.
And if you apply the same standards that we apply on the investment side, meaning on the investment side, you have certain asset classes, bonds, equities, that you sort of keep in your portfolio because you never know when you're going to need that asset class to sort of cover you. Well, our organizers are asset classes. These are blue chip organizations that regardless of the strategy, we need to have them in our portfolio in perpetuity. Because if it's a policy strategy, if it's a legal strategy, you need these organizations on the ground. So, and when on the investment side, we don't evaluate our asset managers like per year, their performance this year. It's 3, 5, 10-year horizons. On the programmatic side, it's a different dynamic. So it's really getting board members to understand that these are investments and we want to take the principles from over here and bring them over here. Now, we've got to recognize in philanthropy, we have a lot of power. And that power comes in what I call cash and cachet. And the challenge is often, and this is where we have to be reflective, some of us liked the process where organizations have to come to us every year and say, you know, hey, I need this. And that's what I would call power hungry. And we've got to move to a place of power harnessing. we have this power. We know what they need. Now, how can we begin to connect the dots and collectively increase the power and shift that power to the people who are closest to the challenges and closest to the solutions? But it starts with understanding that I have access to the resources, but I don't have the best answers. So I need to get the resources to the people and the organizations that have the answers. So this isn't that, I joked about whether or not we would call this a game-changing strategy. It's already there. It's just that we need to shift the power harnessing and get out of this mode of providing just enough resources to make the back of the bus comfortable.
So when we began, I promised this room that we would have a chance to have questions and discussions brought to our panelists from you all. And so I wanted to take a moment now to open this space. I'll start with you, sir, and then I'll come to you. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I miss a hand? I apologize. We're going to start.
I'm about to jump out of my seat.
No.
Sean Atkins Jerome, leading up the Weisberg Foundation, a private endowed foundation in Virginia. A couple of things that resonated with me that I want to talk about, and something that might be session 2. What resonated when I came into philanthropy, sustainability meant, have you done enough so that you don't need our funding, you're getting funding from another organization.
That's right.
And I like, John, the way you are saying we need to be talking about sustainability in a fundamentally different way.
Right.
Second, our mission is a dedication to racial equity and racial justice. And one of the things that we're thinking about a lot is how we invest our endowment in racially just ways. And I really appreciate the approach you mentioned with the 5 years where organizations get to learn with you into, what the vision is. The third part, I'm about to hurt feelings, because SHOT needs to fundraise to do this. But private endowed foundations, we don't need to fundraise.
That's right.
So when are we going to start having the conversation with our boards and our investment committees around growing our endowments to what end? What is the purpose? If you have a $200 million endowment and you take and endow organizations with half of it, you still have $100 million.
Did you say B? Billion?
I said million.
Oh,
But it goes into also, whose money is it? And Zakia
Yes.
mentioned reparations and philanthropic reparations, and the idea of us uncovering our wealth creation story. And I just feel like you've laid out for us a roadmap for talking about this money, the accumulation to what end, its power. So I can say, well, my foundation is 200 million, we're bigger than your foundation, which is 50 million. What is that about?
Right.
And so I would love for us to be thinking about how do we have that conversation about getting into the purpose of foundations.
That's good.
wow, that's beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
And can I add just broader context to what you're saying about private foundation endowments? So the Chronicle of Philanthropy did a study, this was I think pre-COVID, and they looked at what is the total size of all not-for-profit endowments. And total, they said, is over $11.7 trillion. Wow. Okay? Private foundations represent the largest of that. Okay? So to your point, endowments to what end? And that was pre-returns of over 20% last year. So I'm going to guess that the size of endowments have doubled, maybe even tripled. Okay, so if 5% of that was directed, or a portion of that was directed towards not-for-profit endowments, non-private foundation endowments. I'm not talking about colleges and universities, but I'm talking about to organizations like these, we would be having a very different conversation.
That's right.
Right.
So I think context is really important.
Thank you for that. Wow. Yes, sir.
Rodney Trapper, University of the District of Columbia Foundation. I connected with Sister
Zakia.
Zakia, in terms of when you say endowment, not even know what that is. And when our organizations are just praying to make payroll at the end of the week, and they're at the beginning of the week, and they're just hoping to get there, are there toolkits that are there to educate our staff leaders, our boards about the value of establishing an endowment? Let's just start there. Because everyone is not there. They're saying, look, we got these day-to-day things that we need to focus on, and we can't even think beyond that. But endowment is not even in their vocabulary. So are there toolkits that we can have to help educate our community about not only the value, but then what are the steps to go about doing that? You're doing it in your community, but we'd like to export this all over the country.
Yeah, I don't know if Lee wants to sort of add to, I would say that's a part of the process of what we want to create as a part of this journey, just that. The first phase of it is calling the question within philanthropy. The other phase is engaging the organizations and going through that process. That's why it was important to us, not just to raise the money and give it away, but have the organization sitting with us throughout the process, the quarterly meetings, the investment meetings, so that at the end of the 5-year period, they may decide we want our $10 million in our organization and we want to manage it ourselves. That's fine, and they will be prepared to do so.
Yep. And to further expound upon John's point, so yes, we are building what that toolkit is, because the reality is twofold. One, there's a lot of information out there about endowments, right? What they are, but what we at JP Morgan Chase have said in partnership with SHOT is that we are going to provide a training curriculum that we have designed that is customized for not-for-profits to understand everything about endowments, not just what they are, how to create them, how to manage them, how to maintain them, how to govern them. And what that means is that the customization is not that the information isn't out there, but how do you translate it so that when I'm sharing this with Zakia, Zakia knows exactly what she and her board need to do, and she can then articulate that to someone else. That's the customization piece. And we've done that on the JP Morgan Chase side to be able to help those not-for-profits do exactly what you're saying.
Yes, one question here.
So we started to do some endowment work earlier last year, and one of the unforeseen things that came up for us was some of our organizations in the management of communications in their respective communities about getting that much money. And so I'm curious, so we had to pivot really quickly to be able to support and help them and figure out how to talk about it. But if you all have any strategies for when it's not seen as a positive thing in communities where people are trying to manage, people then think, they don't need anything, or they got all the money and trying to deal with those kinds of issues.
So, and that's a two-way street, right? Because you could have people in the community complaining because you're getting too much money, and people outside of the community. It is around narrative management, but it also shows up in a way as a part of the structural barriers that has been put in front of our communities. Because if Zakia or whomever working in a local community, these oftentimes are working poor or working class communities, and you say, what, you're going to put $5 million over there? Well, what about me? I don't want to talk to you. How much you going to pay me? Because that scarcity mentality bubbled up. So it is about narrative control. And it's hard. There's no silver bullet because it's based on the local community, the relationship of the organization to the community, how the leadership show up, what's the succession of that organization. The founders are oftentimes someone that people like, this person is it, we love them, they walk on the moon, and then the next generation that come in, who are these people? They're not like the founder.
That's right.
So it is no silver bullet, and I'm glad you say you invested in communications, because that has to be considered on the front end and stewarded throughout the process.
That's right.
And no matter how much you provide, it's still short of the need.
That's right.
And when, you know, Lee talks about how the market performed 20%, you know, we're catching up on this to the point Zakiya made. The other side has already done this. So a 20% increase in the market means Heritage Foundation has 20% more capacity. ALEC has 20% more capacity. Our groups don't have that.
That's right.
And so we're just trying to catch up and at least give them fighting chance, of which many battles they're winning with less. But they can do more with more.
Yes, sir.
I'm Jamar Boyd from the Samuel Proctor Conference in Chicago, Illinois, and we are a Black faith-based nonprofit, a social justice network of churches and pastors. And so, President Johnson, we worked with NAACP for 20 years. Sister Zakiya, it was good to hear you because it is a different world in Black faith-based nonprofits. I think I can name 20 white faith-based organizations who we have done work with who have an endowment. They've had an endowment since year one. Whereas we are entering year 20, and one of our co-founders is the Reverend Jeremiah Wright. And so there is a natural hesitation to engage us because they know Black liberation theology, a consistent fight for reparations, but they also know our work as far as truth-telling commissions in Louisiana as well as in Elaine, Arkansas. So uncovering this work of racial inequities, racial injustice, and doing it through the church to where we understand it's not competition, it is complement, it is collaboration. Where we work with 70 seminaries across the country, 2 universities in South Africa. But to everybody's point, every year we're looking at, are we going to make budget? We have grantees who don't care about, we granted $250,000 last year to Black churches, to young seminarian graduates, some who were able to buy their first house, some who were able to buy their first car, and one person who bought a new mattress for the first time in 30 years. You can't write that
That's
as
right.
a benefit of
That's
an
right.
investment.
That's right.
To them, it's no return on investment, but to us, it's the literal transformation of somebody's life. So I think this other part of this conversation is considering Black faith-based nonprofits who do the work of liberation, who do the work of racial justice and equities, but we are going through the church, going through different mechanisms to reconform relationships with the AME Young People's Department like I did last week, and we are now immersing them in our work at the United Nations. Those are things that a faith-based Black nonprofit can do without shrinks, right? Without contingencies to alliance and loyalties to one space. So that's the reality we deal with as well.
So up in there, there's a whole set of funders that focus just on faith-based work. Eli Lilly Foundation generated hundreds of millions of dollars every quarter since the pandemic. Their quote is faith-based funding. You'd be hard-pressed to see where they've given any real money outside of some service program in the Black community, and it's a hard stop there. With a pause and a stare, right? So, you know, but if you also look at the mainline denominations, they're sitting on tons of resources. The Episcopal Church on down the line. So there is room at the end. It's figuring out how to carve out that niche and be very intentional about it. What I always say, it is not a competition. Why? Because those who seek status quo, they want to see me an advancement project fight. They want to say, well, NACP's here, color change is there. And this one is over there. They want to see that. But that's not our lived reality, because when you go to Zakiya's work at that one, she don't care if we show up as NACP, color change, or the baby's being hurt, who gonna help? And there's so much money. You know, and I have a habit of calling names. So when I talk about SPLC, it's not the current leadership, it's the prior. And because I knew them too, and we used to call them poverty pimps. Because they will identify misery, do a mass solicitation, generate tons of money, and then turn around and financial institution wealth management will put them in front of their people almost quarter to say, let me tell you about the work we're doing. And it's oftentimes with a Black face, right? That's a level of evil sophistication that we have to develop a sophistication that's for the right reason because we live the reality of the outcome.
Right.
And so, you know, I'm more to help, willing to talk to you afterwards, but broadly what John is doing here is game changing. Using the leverage of the Shock Foundation to say, wait a minute, this something else is new. And I'm willing to see of all of those foundations, some of you are at these foundations who made these $100 and $200 million commitments after George Floyd. Where's the money?
Where is it?
All the corporations who make these. For 1 year. Right, yeah, 1 year, right? Because it gives you this balloon and you drop off. Now what? Are we a post-racial society now? We tried that in 2008. We found out that wasn't the case.
Right.
And so, you know, as you go back to your institutions, figuring out, you know, we all have different levels of access and power within our institutions. What can we do to start seeding a course where, whether we're going through another strategic planning process that, you know, to go through every so often, or being able to sit at the table, or making sure as a staff or program officer you are part of the investment committee or staff and investment committee to see that conversation, that becomes important to the outcome of the work. Because many of our organizations are outcome driven as opposed to output driven. Some of the things that our organizations do and achieve, other organizations would have gotten funded 10 times for the output just to lead to that outcome. And figuring out what's that balance so that we are more than just in the room and showing diversity because we're in the room, that we're actually actively engaged strategically, whether you voice that or not, to move the course of foundations in the different directions. We are all sitting in these seats because people push for us to sit in these seats. The question is, at my tenure as steward in this seat or stewards in your seat, are we going to make the seats better for our community?
Yes, ma'am? Right here?
Oh,
Yeah, and then we'll come to you.
Yeah, so my
Maria.
name is Harambee. I'm the founder and executive director of the Black and Brown Campus Store of Michigan. I'm here at the conference on behalf of the Black Legacy Fund for the Grand Rapids Community Foundation. And I'm sure most of you know the funeral for Patrick Lutlow is happening right now. And the text thread is blowing up. And everyone's, you know, collectively mourning. But there's this underlying discussion around how we leverage the moment and all of our failures from policy to this new opportunity to bring institutions like the foundation together. And the people that are really critical to this conversation, at least in Black Grand Rapids right now, are much younger. And so the first leg of the fight was we need more money. And so the foundation's like, we're gonna start this legacy fund for the Black community. And when I go to the other folks on this advisory board and say, you know, the foundation wants to know how much we should put in endowment out of, you know, this first allocation of $1 million. They're like, why do we want to put money in endowment, right? Like, for what? Let's put money in the hands of grassroots organizations that are doing the work, and let's do this, this, and this. And what I came here today hoping was that we would find some, myself, we would find some tangible resources that we could take back, because like you, we had to Google what's an endowment, right? I have a C3, but I tell people all the time when they give us this, like, you guys are a model nonprofit because we're the cannabis industry. I don't do charity, I don't do any grants. I've had a nonprofit now for 3 years, and I've never taken a grant. All my money comes from corporate donations because I consider it cannabis justice reparations. They paid our work, and we do expungement. We're the largest organizers of expungement fairs, employment opportunities, and entrepreneurial support from Detroit to Flint to Ben Harbor. And so now that I'm in this philanthropy space, I'm still figuring it out. I don't really have all the answers. And while I've been listening and taking notes and trying to get great highlights to take back, if there are actual presentations, podcasts, books that can kind of break down the role that endowment can play in the future of both our fund and our community, I think that caters not to the brilliant philanthropists, but more so the on-the-ground actors, the single mothers like me, so we can make this very real to us. That would be beneficial, I think, for our community and for our organization right now.
Thank you for that. And thank you for the call for us to be responsive in this moment itself. As John said, we...
You know, the only thing I would say there, you know, I've heard someone say when we sort of talk with different folk about this concept, well, if you keep the money in your endowment, you can invest it in different ways, it would earn more. And you can fund those organizations for longer and give them more. That would be true if foundations consistently funded the organization.
Yeah.
So if you saw
Right.
over the next 15, 20 years, there was a 20-year grant commitment, that would make sense. But that's not the case. What you see is a very mercurial trend. 2 years on, 4 years off,
Right.
crisis, rapid response, 2 years off. So, you know, another bridge challenge would say, hey, yeah, you want to make a commitment, a 20-year commitment to fund? That may be another alternative. But short of that, we do need to talk about how do we, build these endowments for organizations.
Thank you. So I had two more questions at the back of the room. I think that's what we have time for. Please.
Well, first of all, I'm very, very excited about this conversation. I am Denise Smith at the Century Foundation. I'm a researcher, advocate, and lead on higher education policy at the foundation. And I did a report about HBCU endowments. So I'm very excited that we're having this conversation. And I'm doing a lot of work trying to get federal policy to understand their role in helping to endow historically Black colleges and universities, talking to a lot of leadership at HBCUs to understand the importance of this as well, but also the policies that are established throughout the Department of Education really say that if a HBCU gets an endowment or money towards their endowment, there is also a responsibility for them to raise private unrestricted funds to match what they receive from the federal government. And so it's a kind of a call to people in this room to understand that there are institutions like all the public HBCUs in Mississippi that are going to run out of their heirs funding because that lawsuit money is going to run out next year. How do we help those institutions continue to stay vibrant and think about the longevity of those institutions moving forward? How do we think about what happened in Maryland and if they did not have enough funding, how else can we help those institutions in the future? So a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is really focused on the endowment, so I'm very excited about the work that you're doing at the foundation and love to hear more about it and how we can continue to collaborate.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah.
This is great. I love seeing people I love. And I'm definitely like still sitting with how all of this plays out organizationally, like that's what this conversation's about. And I'm also coming out of the breakfast plenary, also thinking about how this plays out individually in our communities, because the same things that happens at banks and financial institutions, organizations, are happening individually, right? So yes, I can walk into this 3 banks where I have accounts and say I'd like to speak with a financial planner, but I don't get to talk to a wealth manager unless I have a certain amount of money. And at those same nonprofits, there are very few gift planners I can talk to, let alone gift planners of color, right? And so there is not a clear line or like I don't even want to use the word standard, but there's that gap too, right, around our individual community wealth education, not just closing the wealth gap, but like the actual education of what is happening in this current system that we have to exist in around wealth, its active accumulation and its management, and what power and agency we have over however we define what our wealth is. That is a gap. That's not racial, that's just in our community, a gap. And then organizationally, we're seeing it play out at that level as well. And then another thing that was coming up for me when this brother over here was talking about faith-based organizing, someone getting a mattress for the first time is a big deal. We should just get used to saying that and not apologize for it. If I've been alive for 30 years and I never had a new mattress, that's a big freaking deal. It is. Celebrate. And I feel like we should be very clear on what our metrics that we measure our success against. We have to name it, right? And so I think that the piece that Derek was bringing out, President Johnson was bringing out about the communication, I do think there's external communication, but communication for me is a tool for relationship building and education. So what are the ongoing informative exchanges that are happening in our community about how we talk about these things every day? Not just when a big crisis hits, not just when a big grant comes in, but there are, I grew up in a majority Black city up north. We are terrified as a community of development. We have no tax base. There are 435 churches in our 4.3 square miles. There's 70% renters. You can on your taxes take off if you pay a mortgage, but not if you pay rent.
No.
And we all paying rent and we're paying higher utilities than our communities around us. Hillary Clinton and Martha Stewart live a couple miles up, but down in Black Ass Mount Vernon, we are on the struggle bus, money earning, ain't got none. So it's like, that level of conversation also needs to be discussed, because our community foundation is at the county level, and they're not gonna give us money. Even in arts and culture, our Westchester Arts Council gives $10, $20, $25,000 all throughout the county, but in Black Ass Mount Vernon, they got a little program where the cap is $5,000.
Right.
That type of stuff too needs to be discussed, because if I take this home as an idea today and plant it as a seed, right, which is what I would do, plant it as a seed, I have to take the knowledge I have and know that maybe 20 years from now, this seed might sprout a little something. Right now, today, we're in crisis, we're in trauma, the soil ain't too healthy, but I can take this little seed and do something. But I just wanted to, like, that connection between the organizational, it's happening because at the community level, the trauma and crisis and pain, we need to figure out how to talk about that too in the arc of where we want to go. Not just our standard is if white folks are buying houses at this rate, that's the rate we should be buying. That don't make no sense.
Right.
It has to be, what is the wealth and we want in our own community, and what does that look like for us? Every time I go to a community meeting, talk about housing, they're like, oh, well, we're gonna put this many units of affordable. I don't want affordable housing, I want a quality luxury home for myself. This cheap affordable housing building is not my vision for myself. You know, so I think that if we had more organizations that can help with that at the community level too, I just feel like the individual knowledge base and reminding people that we have access to imagine and dream and believe for ourselves, I think that's a part of the work too, and we just have to find a way to talk about it in the communication, in the narrative, so it doesn't get lost, and so that we don't also participate in the poverty pyramid, right? Like me, myself, when I used to be full-time fundraising, it was a personal commitment. I'm not gonna talk about my community like it's a deficit. I'm gonna talk about all the stuff you're missing out on by not giving us this grant. You know, and so I just feel that also needs to be a commitment.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for doing such a great job of bringing this together and lifting up such an important part of this dialogue. And thank you for all participating today and lifting up any number of things that we need to continue to work on, right? This was the beginning of a discussion. We know this work. We know there's the opportunity of this work, and that there's so much more we can and should be doing in community in support of one another. So I want to take a moment and thank you all for being here with us today, for being part of our panel, for sharing your expertise. Thank you for being participants. We appreciate it.